All right, so the topic that we want to cover is advertising. And so I'm gonna give the broad picture and then narrow it down specifically to advertising and then do a deep dive into advertising and also make it more specific and relative. So let me do the broad picture first and then come into specific advertising. So when we talk about marketing, the word marketing is essentially everything you do. So a lot of people confuse different words with marketing, advertising, sales, promotions, publicity. So let me help just kind of clear that up. So marketing is essentially everything that is done sent from the senses. So when we say marketing, most commonly when we say marketing, most of us have heard of what are called the 5 Ps of marketing. Essentially, the 5 Ps are very broad swopes of categories. And number one is obviously your product or your service is the first one. That how does it, and each one obviously has its specifics relative to its application within your target market. So number one is your product or service, and then number two is your proximity. Number three is your price. Number four is your people, and then number five is your promotions. So we're not going to talk about the people category. We're not going to talk about the price category. We're not going to talk about the proximity category. All these are all important relative to marketing, and we're not going to talk about the product or service category. So specifically, I'd like to move over into the promotions category specifically. So the big topic is marketing, and so the subtopics are the 5 Ps that I just enumerated, and specifically I'd like to isolate promotions. Now the subcategories of promotions are going to be, and this is very important, is going to be publicity, advertising, and sales. And they all have different functions, and so all of it's based on the S-curve of economics, and of course, that's how all products and services move through markets, is called the S-curve of economics. Now, knowing where your product or service is what is so vital relative to marketing to know what to do. Do I do publicity? Do I do advertising? What type of advertising? What type of sales? So its application is an understanding of each of those is vital to the S-curve. So in general, when you look at a market, I'm going to just make a general statement. Generally speaking, when you go after a target market, and first we're going to define a target market with specific factors, and so we're going to talk about what increases the likelihood or the prevalence of a purchase. So the core might be what's called demographics, psychographics, geographics, psychographic barriers, gateways, vehicle deliveries. Those are 6 common factors that will give you a highly more probable target market. And each of those are well defined and talked about in separate videos. But specifically what we're talking about here is advertising. So let's say we've already defined our target market relative to the S-curve. And so we're looking at advertising relative to the S-curve. Now typically what happens from an S-curve perspective, in other words, to take a product or service and enter it into the market saturation, and have large or good percentage of consumption, is you take it through three categories. You take your target market through publicity first, advertising second, and educational sales third. And there's a reason for that. So that's why the majority of our campaigns, you'll see that it involves some publicity, and then it goes from publicity to advertising, and from advertising to educational sales. And essentially what happens is the low-hanging fruit, publicity is used for name recognition and trust. That's what publicity is used for. And the low-hanging fruit are the higher likelihood prevalence of people. Because remember, throughout the S-curve, there's higher, lower, and middle type of prevalence of consumers within your product or service. So publicity does it work real well? No. Is it highly useful for specific things that you want to do in your marketing program? Yes, it can be very, very effective. And you can't control publicity as far as the response. You can't control a response as much. So publicity is name recognition and authority and trust. That's the purpose of publicity. So typically we'll take that target market, demographics, psychographics, geographics, psychographic barriers, gateways, vehicle delivery, and we'll take the 20th percentile in those categories, the highest probability within each of those categories. So you have a sweet spot from a target market consumption perspective. Then from there, we would start with publicity to create name recognition, authority, and trust. And then you would get some business from that. The higher need type of business, you would get some business from that. And then from there, you would go into advertising. And then the two types of advertising is name recognition and direct response. We're going to go into that specifically. And that would bring in more. Now, advertising essentially is going to just lower the barrier. So when you're looking at that target market outside of the main factors of what defines a target market, demographics, psychographics, geographics, etc., there's three absolute core components that are going to determine whether or not that your target market purchases or acts. And essentially it's their perceived need relative to their obstacles divided by trust. All three of those work together. That's the absolute core of any purchase. So what happens is publicity comes in. When we use publicity, and the higher need people you'll get with name recognition and trust. It's not a lot. And it also is totally relative on where you're at on the S-curve, likewise. Then we would come into that same target market and introduce advertising, preferably direct response advertising, not name recognition advertising. And then from the direct response advertising, really the goal there is to minimize or eliminate the barrier to entry. In other words, the advertising is really only still going to be focused on people who have a perceived need, who want that product or service, but they're limited or stopping the action because of typically their obstacles or the trust issue. So if the need is there, with advertising, all we're trying to do is lower the barriers to entry. And typically in a chiropractic office, that's time or money. And it's not just a chiropractic office, but almost any product or service specifically. But specifically now, more so specifically money. So then all we're trying to do is lower the barrier to entry of money through discounts, offers, and things of that nature to make it lower than the perceived need. When that happens, they'll also act as long as there's not a violation of trust. So that's how we would use advertising relative to publicity, and that's how advertising would work. Then from the advertising, we would move into educational sales, because in educational sales, when you have somebody that's trained in educational sales, we can control all three factors. We can establish need within that target market, so we can help to alter or modify the need. Then we can also minimize or eliminate obstacles or barrier to entry, and then we can also affect the trust category. So we can affect the absolute core of a purchase with educational sales. We cannot do that with advertising or publicity. We cannot control all three of those factors. So essentially, when a product or service is entered into the market, you'll have publicity followed up for name recognition, trust, and authority, the lower hanging fruit, the higher need, in other words, the higher need people. It's not a good form of response. And then from there, we go to advertising. So more and more people now will purchase the product. So we target people still, again, with need. If there's no need, advertising doesn't work. So we're actually going after people in the higher need or with need. And then all we're trying to do is help to lower the barrier of entry, specifically time and money, relative to their need. And hopefully in a trust category, or introduce trust into the category also. That enables action, and so you'll get even more business in the S-curve. You'll saturate and go into the market deeper. And then the last category is educational sales, where now we've had name recognition, authority, trust, we've had offers, but now we can come in with that high target market. Remember, everything we're talking about here is still a high 20th percentile target market, demographics, psychographics, geographics, psychographic barriers, gateways, vehicle delivery. So it's still a high probability market. Now we can come in and we can actually establish need, or where maybe it's being minimized or reduced. So we can actually establish the need, minimize the obstacles, barrier to entry, typically time or money, more so money, with offers, bonuses, etc. And so we will change the equilibrium of need relative to obstacles. That will increase the likelihood of the purchase, and we can also introduce trust factors within the marketing, or we can just flat out go into a trust category. And so the 5 categories of marketing, every marketing program is in one of 5 categories. It's either an introduction marketing program, an active referral, passive referral, it's either a lead or a cold call. And you get a higher percentage of business if it's an introduction, up to 75% of potential business. So you can have the exact same marketing program, do it in an introduction system, and it'll work way better than a cold call system. And so the statistics are 75%. You can get up to 75% of introductions, up to 55% with active referrals, up to 20% with leads, and only 1% with cold calls. And the two main factors that make one more effective than the other, that's if your marketing program stays the same, is trust and need. So if it's an introduction or active referral, passive referral marketing program, there's high trust. Where in a cold call lead, there's no trust, or very, very little. And then need. So in an introduction, I can actually target people that have high need or a higher need, versus a cold call, they could have absolutely no need at all. So that's the difference in why one program is way more effective potentially if it's the exact same program in an introduction versus a cold call category. So having said that, the other component that we just want to be aware of is when we do our advertising, we do want to be aware of, and so that's how we can go into market saturation. We can get more and more business if we understand how to use publicity relative to advertising, relative to educational sales. Now, we're specifically going to talk about advertising. Now, advertising, there's two types of advertising. There's two types of advertising. Now, remember, when we're talking about advertising, we're only talking about people who are actively looking for your product or service. If they're not looking for your product or service, or if in other words, they don't have a need and they're not looking for you, advertising doesn't work. And the average consumer has about 4,000 to 5,000 different images and advertising images that crosses their path in any given day. And so it's a real battle out there for name recognition, etc. And so if they don't have a perceived need, then advertising won't work at all. So in chiropractic, let's say, there's only 8% of the population looking for a chiropractor. So publicity and advertising essentially works only for the 8%. And so when you go to the 92%, we talk about how there's a lot of people over there with back and neck related problems, up to 73 out of 4 of them, 3 out of 4, 1 out of 4 won't have a particular problem. And then so will advertising and publicity get those people? Well, no, it won't, because they're not looking for a chiropractor. So in that particular case, we would possibly want to use publicity for name recognition, trust, and authority. Then we would use some advertising specifically to help lower the barriers to entry, promotions, bonuses, etc. But then we would also use educational sales to help to establish need. So now we have a sweet spot relative to a target market, demographically, psychographically, geographically, gateways, and vehicle of delivery. So we have an optimal target market in the right side of that S-curve. And then we're going to go apply publicity combined with advertising, come in with educational sales, and that's how you can go in deep into the masses of the S-curve and essentially control a particular market. So when we talk about advertising, there's two types of advertising. Basically speaking. And so when we talk about advertising, there's what's called name recognition advertising, and then there's what's called direct response advertising. And name recognition advertising is basically you have your name out there, essentially. It might be like a billboard. You're driving down the road and there's a billboard that says Budweiser. Okay, that's a name recognition. And so in other words, they're not targeting anybody at all. It's just a broad spectrum name recognition. Well, that type of advertising, small business owners and chiropractors want to totally stay away from. It's for many reasons. Number one is it's not effective. It's not very effective. You're not going to get very much name recognition trying to compete against 5,000 different images in a particular day. You don't have the budget for it. The amount of impressions that you have to create in somebody's mind to overcome the competition of 5,000 other images, the budget a small business owner does not have. So you want to essentially stay totally away from name recognition advertising. In the chiropractic office, really the only name recognition advertising you'll probably do is your sign, And I even try to create more of a direct response and more specific with a sign, or your window dressings, or what's on your front of your office, side of your office, etc. Outside of that, there's no you don't want to do anything relative to name recognition, essentially, or at least tweak it and modify it to increase its specificity with approaching your target market to whatever degree you can. Of course, that depends on the vehicle delivery and what's involved, et cetera, et cetera. So that's name recognition advertising. Now, when we go into direct response advertising, that's the kind of marketing that is way more effective, and here's why, is we're actually going to find out who our target market is. So who's our demographics? So we have 7 different categories demographically. So we may consider age, marital status, familial status, how many kids they have, education, income. So these are some of the common indicators that are demographics. That's called demographics. And demographics essentially tell you who is buying. Who is buying. That's very important. Who is buying. So we always want to be aware of that, and we want to be aware of what's called the 80-20 rule, or the Pareto law. That's the 80-20 rule. Pareto is the economist, the Italian economist, who showed basically that a minority creates a majority, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit. But the majority of people of a demographic profile, in other words, if I were to take one slice of that demographic profile and say age group, well, it's not linear. That age group all does not participate with chiropractic services, or eat pizza, or buy chocolate ice cream. In other words, it's a variant, and there's a greater and a lesser proportional. And so we want to be aware of who is the highest probability within that demographic market. In other words, age group. There's certain age groups that by far and large will pick chiropractic way more than other age groups. And many of these factors, you might have an opinion, or you might be aware of it, but most of them you'll never even know. They're factors you'll never even know, and they're multiple factors, from how they were raised, to their culture, to their religion, to the economics, to where they live. I mean, there's just a multitude of factors in why people do what they do. But you can segment out, and when you segment out, they do segment out into the 80-20 rule. So demographically, I can pick the top 20% of people with an age group, whether it's a gender, whether it's an income level, whether it's the marital status. I can pick the highest probability in all these categories where there's a higher prevalence or likelihood of utilizing chiropractic care. And we can find that out through what's called reverse engineering. We'll find out who's using the product or service, reverse engineer it, and that'll give us our stats. So we know exactly who the high probability target market is demographically in those 7 categories. Well, we do the same thing in a psychographic market. And psychographics is your lifestyles, your attitudes, and beliefs. And there's about 65 different subcategories. It's segmented into about 9 major subcategories, 65 subcategories. And psychographics determine your, it's not who buys, it's why you buy. So demographics is who is buying, psychographics is why you buy, and it's based on lifestyles, attitudes, and beliefs. And it's very difficult to change a lifestyle, attitude, or belief. You'll go broke trying to change it. A small business owner will go broke trying to change a target market's lifestyle, attitude, and belief, as opposed to getting in front of people, the 20%ers, psychographically, demographically, and geographically, who have the highest predilection, highest likelihood of buying your product or service. And so those are the people you want to put in front of publicity, advertising, and educational sales. The highest probability within that target market. So, and then of course the same applies to geographics and what's called psychographic barriers. And all of these are identified in separate videos, specifically the definitions and what they mean. So we're just going to say, when we're talking about advertising, we're going to assume that we already have what's called the sweet spot. In other words, we already have the 20th percentile, the highest probability demographic, psychographically, geographically, gateways, vehicle delivery. Now, when we do that, we have significantly increased our likelihood of that marketing working, that advertising working, because so we have a lot less people that we're actually putting our message in front of, but we have a much exponentially greater likelihood of them actually responding because of what we just did. We've segmented the 20 percentile of highest probability in multiple categories. So that's called the sweet spot. We have a real sweet, whether it's a list, a group, whatever. Now, with that, we would use advertising. So let's talk a little bit about the formula for advertising. So we already talked about the difference between name recognition and direct response. Well, when we go into a direct response ad or direct response marketing, it could be many forms. We're going to look at this formula. So the formula is, number one is identifying the problem. And we never want to talk about our product or service. It's always understanding within that target market what their primary problem is. And again, this gets back to motivation, and we talk about the 5 different types of motivation, which is present pain, present pleasure, future pleasure, curiosity. And where is the highest prevalence of motivation? Well, 80% of it is based on present pain, not future pain, not present pleasure, not future pleasure, not curiosity. Those are all 5% each. So those are very small factors of what motivates people. Overwhelmingly, what motivates human beings, 80% is what's called pain-based, and it doesn't have to be physical pain. It could be physical pain, emotional pain, psychological pain, and it's pain-based, and it's based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so if you look at the primary, if there's a restriction or limitation in a primary need, those are your physiological needs: food, shelter, oxygen. That's where you will spend and focus your time and money to make sure to stabilize that. And then once you have that, then the next factor is security. So those are the 2 pain-based categories of motivation. That's where over 80% of people spend their time and money, is trying to get out of those categories and stay out of those categories. And then the pleasure-based categories start going into socialization, materialization, and self-actualization. So that's all Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so that has to do with motivation. So that's really what motivates people. So instead of trying to impose your motivation on them, and chiropractors are pretty good at doing that, trying to impose a philosophy or a wellness care. It seems to be one of the latest things is wellness care. And the vast majority of people are not motivated by wellness care. They're motivated by Maslow's hierarchy of need, avoiding a primary, secondary pain and motivation. So this is the communication. So when I talk about the problem of advertising, we want to identify a problem way more than a pleasure. And out of all the potential problems, remember we have the 80-20 rule. There's a 20% of them that overwhelmingly represent the majority of the problems, and that is based on Pareto's law, the economist Pareto. So that's what that's based on. None of this has to do with chiropractic philosophers and chiropractic theory. So it has to do with human beings and how they naturally act and respond and are motivated innately, subconsciously. So that's how we would identify the problem. So we have our target market first, based on the factors I talked about, demographic, psychic, etc. Then we'd have the problem. That would be our advertising. So we're identifying what is of value to them. What are they willing to spend time and money on? What are they restricted? And I explained how that works. Now, if there's a problem, then there's a solution. So there's problem, solution. And your solution is whatever it is you do. So, and there's factors that are more or less important relative to a solution. But it's problem, solution. And then the next category is why you. And the why you category is the trust category. So that's the trust category. And typically that's endorsements and testimonials. And so now we're affecting trust to decrease defenses and resistance. So we've identified we've got a sweet spot of high probability in the target market, demographically, psychographically, geographically, gateways, psychographic barriers, and vehicle delivery. So we're already dealing with a high probability target market, and then we communicate with them with advertising not name recognition, but direct response, as much as possible, as many of these factors as we possibly can, depending on your vehicle delivery, etc. So then we would have your that's the way I identified the problem with this sweet spot target market. Hopefully it's a primary pain-based problem that we identified, Pareto's law. Number 2 is the solution. You're offering the solution. Number 3 is the why you to affect trust. That's authority and trust. So problem, solution, why you. And then there's typically the offer. And the offer is to minimize or eliminate the barrier to entry. And remember, most products and services, the barrier to entry is time or money, overwhelmingly money more than time. Could vary depending on your product or service, but that's most of every product or service, and that is the way it is in chiropractic. Money being overwhelmingly more important than time, but money and time overwhelmingly being of great significance. And of course, the next one is trust. Trust is the major factor. But so it's time and money. So the advertising would have, we would lower the barrier to entry with money. Might be offers, bonuses, things like that. So that's the offer. So we'd have the offer. And then, so it's problem, solution, why you offer. And then we'd have limitations. Limitations, in other words, that creates scarcity. As human beings, we want something. If there's a limit, we prefer to have it as opposed to have somebody else have it. So when we create limitations, that creates an impetus for an action. And remember, that's important because every 24 hours when somebody does not act, the motivation decreases 50%. And that's a generalization. But as you know, as time goes on, our motivation typically decreases, barring external circumstances, events. Of course, I'm being very general, but it's a good generalization. So that's why we want to create an action so as fast as we can, because their motivation is decreasing rapidly over time. So how are we going to do that? Well, one way is creating limits, and then also limits with whatever it is you're offering, and then deadlines, and then also a deadline. So it's not only limited in the deadline. So the limit in the deadline is actually to create the action step to solve their problem with your solution, minimize the barrier to entry, affect trust, and create the action step. So it's problem, solution, why you, offer, deadline, limited call to action with limitations of deadlines and limits. And so that's the characteristics of what we will always look at every time we incorporate an advertising campaign. So in summary, what we would want to do is pick the highest target market demographically. There's 7 categories. We'd want to pick the highest target psychographically. That's lifestyles, attitudes, and beliefs. There's 65 subcategories, segments, but the Pareto's law applies to that too. All of those people do not naturally pick chiropractic. It doesn't matter if they have a spine or not. It's what their perception of their reality is. Next one is the geographics. What's the highest likelihood, prevalence of draw geographically? And that's very important with a brick and mortar business. And it does vary depending on the density of your population, how many obstacles it takes to get to and from, and the frequency to get to and from. Well, in a chiropractic office, classically, if you're in an inner city, it's 1 mile, because it's very difficult to move, because you're seeing somebody maybe 2 or 3 times a week also. Where maybe with an attorney, it'd be a great distance, because maybe you're seeing them once. Or a dentist, if you see them every 6 months, they have a much greater radius of draw, because you're only maybe seeing them once every 6 months. It's not 3 times a week. So it has to do with the obstacles. It's the traffic, the lights. There's many obstacles that add up, and all of these are subconscious. They're not typically on a conscious level. And then there's what's called psychographic barriers, and those are subconscious perceptions of restrictions and limitations of why people will or won't go in particular directions. And common psychographic barriers are waterways and major roadways and railroads and large land masses like golf courses and industrial parks and things like that, and moving away from economic hubs versus to economic hubs. And again, this is all in a separate video when we talk about this. So if we've identified demographically, psychographically, geographically, and psychographic barriers, we have this 20th percentile on each one of those. We have this we have a much, much smaller list than just everybody in that whole list, but we have the highest probability of who's going to do it and why they're going to do it and the likelihood of them going to do it. Then we use what's called a vehicle of delivery. What is a common vehicle of delivery for that target market? And there's many vehicles of delivery, from direct response mails, TV, radio, email, internet. So, some markets are more unique than others. They're not all the same. Every market is varied to some degree, one or another, or percentages. And then what's called gateways. What's the likelihood? What do they naturally associate with you? Because if you violate a gateway, that creates a paradigm shift. And paradigm shifts are terrible. They kill advertising. Paradigm shifts violate trust. They increase defenses. They decrease confidence. And they increase your consumer resistance. So anytime you do paradigm shifts, it's terrible. And using foreign words and concepts and things that they're not used to is called paradigm shift. So you want to do absolutely no paradigm shift. So we have this absolute sweet spot, this 20th percentile. And then from them, we have the categories I just talked about: demographically, psychographically, geographically, psychographic barriers, vehicle of delivery, gateway. Then we have our advertising. So we're using what's called direct response. It's very specific to a very specific group of people. Why? And the message is highly specific. So now we're going to identify that target market's gateway. We're going to identify their primary restriction or limitation. In other words, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of what they can't do, what they're most willing to spend time or money, what the highest motivation is for that person. And then, so that's problem. Then we're going to identify the solution. What's our solution to help them? Problem, solution. And then YU is the trust category. That's typically endorsements, testimonials. There's many ways of doing this. This is just the outline to it. So that's the trust category, to help decrease defenses and resistance and increase acceptance. And then, so it's problem, solution, YU, offer. And the offer is to lower the barrier to entry, which is typically time or money, more so money. So that's the offer. And then we create restrictions with limits in the offer and deadlines to create an impetus, because time kills all deals. So time decreases over time, motivation decreases. Everybody has a busy life, things happen. So we want people to act now, not later. And so that's the call, and then that's the call to action. So that's a classic, what's called direct response advertising, as it relates into the realm of publicity, advertising, and sales, as that relates into promotions, and as promotions relate into the general word of marketing.